Holy Jesus. What is that? What the fuck is that? What is that, Private Pile?
When you watch Kraut's video to me, you'll notice he's making very conceptual arguments with a bunch of academic splash in the background, but the arguments he's actually making are very conceptual, very bad, but they're not empirical arguments, really. So then what is the point of all of these sources? Who are these sources for? It's clear he hasn't read them. In one point in the video, he mentions that an effect size in a study in an article he's talking about is so small that it must fall within the margin of error.
By genetic variation, and because of its small size, it is well within the margins of error.
But if you read the abstract, you'll find that no, there's a positive effect size with a 95% confidence interval in all three of the conditions analyzed. Now, the article he cites was written by Francis, who's no longer at the site, and it was written 1 year and 7 months ago, but whatever, I'll defend it. The basic problem with Kraut and this Chem Savant 47 guy's criticism is that they don't know what quantitative genetics is. Okay? I'll just read something from the textbook Behavioral Genetics by Robert Plomin. Quote, for complex behavioral traits in the human species, an experiment of nature, twinning, and an experiment of nurture, adoption, are widely used to assess the net effect of genes and environments. The theory underlying these methods is called quantitative genetics. Quantitative genetics estimates the extent to which observed differences among individuals are due to genetic differences of any sort and to environmental differences of any sort without specifying what the specific genes or environmental factors are. ... Behavioral genetics uses the methods of both quantitative genetics and molecular genetics to study behavior. Toward the end of the video, when Francis says that you don't have to find the genes in order to infer heritability, Kraut and Chem Savant 47 just laugh like this is somehow crazy.
Quote, it should be obvious that we can infer that differences are caused by genes without knowing what the genes are. Let me repeat this. It should be obvious that we can infer that differences are caused by genes without knowing what the genes are.
Oh my god. And I'm gonna make the claim, okay, guys, listen up. You're gonna love this shit. I've got the answer here to how we can use in vivo transfection with Cas9 kits with no rejection process. I can transfect every cell in a person, lickety split, and you can make whatever shifts you want without killing the person. And everybody raises an eyebrow and says, oh, really? You figured that out? Well, dude, how does that work? I'm like, you don't need to know. You don't need to understand how. I just know. It's just like, what the fuck? Like, if I went to a conference doing anything like that, people would laugh thinking I was shitting them. It's like, no, you can't be serious. You're going to be making a claim that's pretty audacious to begin with, and you're basing it on science right here. You're saying there's a scientific basis for this, but we don't need to understand the details. Don't need to know those pesky little details. Dude, this is something that just screams snake oil salesman.
Have you ever heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect?
Yeah, well, laugh till it hurts, but all that's actually happening here is that neither of you know what quantitative genetics is. Now, there are two kinds of twin studies that I know of. Twins reared together and twins reared apart. Twins reared apart is simple enough. You take twins, separate them ideally at birth, but as a young an age as you can get. Now, what's young enough? That's a question. That's a subject of debate. You separate them, and then you see how similar they are in various mental traits at some later age, and you compare this similarity either to the general population or to dizygotic twins or non-identical twins. For example, you look at how much more similar identical twins are than non-identical twins or fraternal twins on a whole host of traits like height, weight, musical interests, IQ score, depression, ratings of aggression. And twins reared together is doing that, but you just compare the similarity traits of identical versus fraternal twins, and you see how much more similar the identical twins are, i.e. how much of a difference a 50% increase in genetic similarity makes, right? And that's how you infer the heritability of these various traits. This is just a really basic outline. Remember, quantitative genetics is a field. There are good twin studies, there are bad twin studies, and there's something called factor analysis, which is like if you want to know the heritability of a difference between groups on something, you can break it down into factors, right? And see if the groups differ on a more heritable versus a less heritable factor or subscore of a trait like aggression or IQ. And you can use that to come up with a between group heritability estimate, right? It's a field, okay? And what these people are doing, Kraut and this chem savant guy, is they're denying either the existence or the validity of an entire field. I mean, often you'll see people saying that their opponents are anti-science, and that's just sort of a you're dumb, I'm smart talking point. But in this regard, I can say that these two goobers are literally against an entire field of research. Now to the meat of this video. The notion that you have to find not only the gene, but the effects of the proteins transcripted and the metabolic pathways in which they operate and how all that manifests, right? There's a very simple way to know that this is wrong, that you don't have to know this. Humans have domesticated crops and animals for thousands of years, literally without even knowing what a gene is, much less what the specific genes they were manipulating or operating did. You don't have to know what a gene is, let alone find the specific genes, to correctly infer that some trait difference is down to a genetic difference. Or, if we don't know what genes are, an innate difference. In order to correctly infer some innate/genetic difference and make successful predictions and be able to genetically modify plants and animals. Another thing to consider is this idea that you have to find the genes only came about when the technology to find the genes started to come about. Before this, nobody was demanding that you find the genes in order to infer heritability. So this isn't some universal standard of evidence that has always existed and was always required. It's just a convention that came about recently among some of the dumber scientists. And today it's being used as a kind of equality of the gaps, because factor analysis and admixture studies, along with a long-running natural experiment that is human civilization up to this point, along with ruling out all sorts of environmental factors that supposedly cause racial IQ differences in IQ, and all that entails, like poverty and nutrition and stereotype threat and discrimination and stress, right? Ruling all those things out. All this combined points to divergent evolution happening in humans. It's a plurality of evidence thing, along with this being something that you would expect to happen if you just believe in evolution in the first place. Now, the molecular genetic stuff is still a little bit new, though not as new as it used to be, and they're starting to come up with robust and replicable genome-wide association studies that measure the general additive heritability of intelligence, not the non-additive portion, but the additive heritability of intelligence within what are called Western populations. But for now, you can't say as much with molecular genetics as you can with non-molecular genetics. For example, I remember back in 2011 when the best molecular genetics estimates for heritability of height was around 10%, whereas the estimates for the heritability of height from the quantitative genetics using the twin studies, those gave you estimates of around 80%. So you had this huge gap between the two. Now, the molecular genetic estimates have improved, and I think they're up to around 40% now. But the thing is, if you want to deny divergent evolution in humans, molecular genetics is a much better place to be, and it serves as a kind of equality of the gaps. Now, there's some confusion that Chem Savant 47 had with my article. He's reading this particular article in isolation as opposed to being part of a set. On the site, I present a whole host of evidences and arguments for differences between the races in what is colloquially referred to as intelligence, as proxied by IQ and various other measures, as being a result of genetic differences. And I worded that in a very specific way, which I'll explain later. And so at the end of the article they're talking about, where Francis says, of course, the genes seem to be on our side, but our case was strong enough even before we had confirmed this. Kraut and Chem Savant, they wave their hands because none of these non-molecular genetic arguments were presented in this particular article that they've selected to make a video about.
Here's the thing. His entire argument up to this point, whoever the author of this site is, I forget the guy's name. It doesn't matter. But the point is, his entire argument up to this point has been about genetic significance between racial groups in terms of neurocognitive ability. And to say that, okay, we don't need to find these genes, well, these papers that he's citing state specific genes already.
Now, listening to the audio, it sounds like Kraut is presenting this to Chem Savant as if this is like the meat and potatoes arguments for race differences in cognitive traits. So it may kind of be Kraut's fault, but then again, Chem Savant didn't bother to check any of this, and Chem Savant has been saying some pretty stupid stuff, period. Another argument Chem Savant made that was just kind of weird was about different genes being expressed differently in different cells.
But to be quite frank, there are SNPs that exist between different tissues. For example, if I were to take sample tissue from your liver, right, and then take another sample from like muscle and out of your arm or wherever, skeletal muscle tissue or smooth muscle tissue, doesn't fucking matter. You're going to find different SNPs in your liver cells than from your muscle cells. So looking at SNPs within different tissues, so what if you've got different SNPs in different tissues? Because, for example, I could have a SNP in my heart that is more prevalent among Asians than it is in white people. And then let's say I've also got a SNP in, let's say, one of my, I don't know, my glute muscles or something like that that's more prevalent among blacks. Do I have black booty and then I've got Asian yellow fever heart? I mean, what's your example here for how this makes any damn difference? That's within the same person.
And I have no idea what any of this is supposed to mean. Cells throughout the body have genes either deactivated or removed outright all the time, he's right, but what this is supposed to be a criticism of, I have no idea. Another thing Chem Savant does is raise the bar. He talks about how you need the sun and the moon to come to any kind of conclusion on heritability.
Where these tissues are going to have this protein expression going on, you need to do protein analysis. And once you've done all that, which I didn't see a single one of these papers do anything that even resembles that kind of analysis, then maybe you've got something to work with here. And I'm not saying that, you know, these SNPs in combination couldn't possibly have an effect. It's just that it's extremely unlikely that they're going to have that massive of an effect between population groups.
Now, this is coming from a guy that doesn't know what quantitative genetics is and has a really stupid find the genes dogma, so all that applies here. But in addition to this, look, Philippe Rushton was the author of the most used intro to psychology textbook, college intro to psychology textbook in Canada at one point. But once he started talking about divergent human evolution, he became a pariah. James Watson was fired from his own institute for having evolutionary thoughts about Africans. Arthur Jensen had to have bodyguards on his campus, this is back in the 1970s and 80s, for his belief in divergent evolution in humans. Or Larry Summers, who was fired from Harvard for saying that evolution may have played a role in sex differences in math and science. Bruce Lawn did some work on a gene that varied by race that had to do with the brain. I forget the specific what is, something encephalus something. But he abandoned that line of research after all sorts of threats and being advised to abandon the research in order to save his career. So when Kraut brings up these experts who make these public statements against divergent evolution in humans, there's only a few things they're going to say. They're going to either outright deny divergent evolution, or they're going to raise the bar and muddy the waters, or if they do believe in divergent evolution, they're not going to say anything at all. What this Chem Savant guy said, you know, this is what his boss wants to hear, this is what his coworkers want to hear, and it's what the people in charge of giving out grants want to hear. Maybe Chem Savant believes every word of what he's saying, I don't know for sure, but this is not a politically neutral environment, and so for Kraut to parade around these experts as if they're going to have some objective, neutral view of this topic is just naive beyond belief. Now, there's a bunch of geneticists and other kinds of researchers who I'm in semi-regular contact with who provide me with a bunch of studies and stuff that I use in my videos and sometimes articles, although rather few of those lately. Not for this video. I didn't need anything for this video. But the problem is that unlike Kraut and unlike this guy Synthetic Dissident, which is a name Chem Savant uses on Twitter, these people that I'm getting data from, these are dissidents. And so I can't tell you who they are, but then of course there's a problem. How do you know no, I'm not just making them up. Kraut likes to talk about how he's in contact with credentialed experts all the time, and the reality is so am I, but the thing is, because my views are dissident views, I don't have the freedom to reveal their identities. And so chem savant, or synthetic dissident, is raising the bar, thus creating a standard that dissident researchers could never attain. Now, I know that the term synthetic dissident, it refers to some CIA document on controlled opposition or something, and it's meant to be kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it's a coincidentally very apt name here. And the kind of anti-scientific demanding of a specific mechanism was also on display when he's talking about evolutionary explanations for race differences.
It doesn't make any sense based on the environment, because those are environments that have their own challenges that are pretty damn significant. People in Egypt don't have, a lovely mild spring where they can just harvest a shitload of crops with tons of fertile land and what have you. They had to make use with limited areas to farm and harshing heat and all that stuff, things like that to survive for a very long time.
So he totally misses the point. There are different physical environments on the planet. These differences in environment produced obvious genetic differences between the races. Why assume identical brains? You could say that because Africa was harsher than Europe, that Africans must be more genetically predisposed to intelligence, however we operationalize that. And their smaller brains, in fact, have more tightly packed neurons, or they're more efficient or something like that. Now, I don't think so, but that would be a far more plausible argument than equal or whatever. I think that modern industrial civilization comes from a population that evolved first with farming in winter. If you're in an area that's so cold that you can't farm, that's a whole different set of cognitive traits. Inuits actually have the physically largest brains of any separable group, and thus probably the most neurons. But their cognitive abilities, at least so far, haven't translated to economic success in modern economies or into high scores on modern IQ tests. The idea is that farming in winter requires planning and develops a set of cognitive abilities that leads to more complex economies than the cognitive traits required to survive in a desert do. Now, I have my own little theory in an article called The European Revolution, involving specific events in the North Sea area, but this chem savant guy doesn't even understand cold winters theory. It's not some stupid, Europe was harsher than everywhere else. That's not the theory. It's about a specific mechanisms in a specific place. But the point is, more broadly, there's no reason to just assume identical genetic tendencies between the races given the differences in environments. But then chem savant goes on to say something that's just really stupid.
And, looking at it on an acute level, let's say we talk about European settlers to Africa or over here in the States, we haven't gotten that much different in a lot of ways, if you look at just encoding. But in terms of intelligence, no, we haven't gotten dumber over here since we came here, or my ancestors came here as colonists. It doesn't make any sense to say, though, because we're in a different environment, because, I got family out in West Texas where it's dry as a bone and hot as hell, that we suddenly got dumber. It's not the same thing for the people in white people in South Africa. They didn't get dumber the past several centuries because they're in a different environment. You're not giving me an explanation for how they're supposed to be getting less intelligent based on a different environment. And some of them will say, okay, well, it hasn't happened yet because not enough time has passed.
Yeah, nobody said that. This is a lie. I know I'm making a bit of a bold claim here, saying that chem savant is lying, but nobody fucking said it just takes more time to... No, the evolutionary environment today is completely different, and the geographic and climatic factors that shaped the evolution of humans in the past aren't necessarily going to be such a big deal today. This is something super obvious. This is something that people broadly call the alt-right, or at least HBD people, they talk about all the time, which is that the evolutionary environment today is radically different from the past, right? And this is why we talk about dysgenics, quote unquote, all the time. And so no, chem savant is just making shit up. So I guess I'll end with something that Kraut actually said at the beginning of his video.
Evidence that would back up and prove conclusively that it is actually genetic. Evidence that would back up and prove conclusively that it is actually genetic.
The phrase Prove conclusively it's genetic. This encapsulates in 4 words so much of what's wrong with Kraut's thinking on all of this. First off, traits aren't genetic. Now, in live speech or in a time-sensitive situation, I may blurt out, that thing, that's genetic or something. But strictly speaking, this isn't the correct way to think about this. All organisms are genes expressed in an environment. An analogy that I like to use is a cake. What percentage of a cake is the ingredients, and what percentage of the cake is mixture and baking? It's a stupid question. The cake is a product of both. It is ingredients expressed in an environment, and we cannot say anything meaningful about what percentage of each contributed to the cake. However, if you have 2 cakes, now we can say in principle something meaningful about the differences between the two cakes. Say they have identical ingredients, but one was baked twice as long. Well, then we could say that the difference between the cakes is a function of the difference in baking time, not a difference of ingredients. Or if they were mixed in the identical way but had different ingredients, we would say whatever differences are between the 2 cakes is a function of the difference of ingredients. And organisms are like this. They are baked cakes. If you're thinking in terms of a trait being a % genetic, then you don't understand how this works. Heritability only means anything in the context of differences between organisms. And look, this isn't the only time Kraut talks about traits, quote unquote, being genetic. And this isn't him talking quickly or off the cuff or something like this. He really thinks in this way fundamentally. But the second part of that statement, and this is seen throughout the whole video, is talking about proof and the sort of attitude of science that Kraut has. There's a cliche that I'm sure most people have heard about, which is that proof is for mathematicians and alcoholics, not scientists. Science is about having a hypothesis, having evidence to support the hypothesis, and making valid predictions. This is where the term valid comes from. It's about predictive validity. It's about making accurate predictions. It's not true, it's not truth, and it's not proof. It's validity. We say something is valid if it predicts. We talk about validity if it works. Science is about what works. And the kind of source flooding that Kraut is doing here, like this isn't science. This is a monstrosity. This is a caricature of science. And your name and the fact that you're German is so fitting because all your allies suck. But unlike the Germans, you don't have any initial success. You get these experts on, you put around these experts and they just suck. They're just pompous and dumb and they never understand what they're arguing against. Not only specifically what they're arguing against, but the topic in general. They're just clueless. And your vendetta against me in particular, it's just weird. And as I told you would happen from the very beginning of this little vision quest that you're on, you're getting your ass kicked and you're continuing to just rage about it and you're just becoming a lol cow. It's like you don't know how the internet works. Where does this energized animosity come from? Do yourself a favor and go back to safe topics and targets like SJWs and all the blue-haired pronouns. Do you really care about this that much? Are you really willing to burn your whole house down in order to fight shit, not even the alt-right? At this point, you're just making videos to me. I mean, in one sense, I'm kind of happy because you've helped my channel grow quite a bit, but I don't understand the psychology here. I don't get what's driving you to do this. I mean, does some idiot expert just get your ear and you think you've got some silver bullet? These arguments are a joke. You mock me here as science man, a term I use for people who imagine that there always exists some intellectuals off in a high tower somewhere that could debunk everything I say, if only they were here. But this is you not understanding what I mean by that term. The term magic science man isn't about using the arguments that an academic gives you. That's, arguing the argument. That's whatever. The term magic science man is about believing that there's some expert out there over the rainbow that could debunk me if only they were here. You're not using their arguments, you're using sort of a mythological conception of the man with the funny hat who could beat me up if you were here. And you're doing more than anyone to shatter that myth by bringing all these experts out of the woodwork and showing that they're just kind of retarded. I mean, not generally speaking. I mean, sure, he can talk a storm about his specialty, but once you get just one step removed from his expertise, even into pretty related fields like quantitative genetics and twin studies, he's not only stupid, but he's militantly and aggressively so, more so than the average person, because he's acting with the same kind of certainty as if he were operating within his own realm of expertise. He's acting in all of this stuff as if this is his area of expertise when it's just not, when he's just kind of a numpty.